Okay, well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to all of you to this session. It's the first in what I'm sure is going to be a really interesting and vibrant week of Civic University network events. We're covering a whole range of subjects through the week, from climate to work with higher and further education, work with business and work with the NHS. But today our focus is on levelling up, and particularly on the challenges around the financing and funding of levelling up. My name is Richard Calvert. I'm Deputy Vice-Chancellor at Sheffield Hallam and also Chair of the Civic University Network Partners Group. And I will just say for my first bit of logistics, we are recording this session, so I hope everyone's happy with that, and we'll be making the session available to anyone who was not able to join us today. So, as I say, the focus today very much on levelling up. It's an issue that will be close to many of our hearts, and to the focus and challenges that many universities face across the UK, but of course also many of our business partners, local authority partners, and others. So I think it's a really relevant and really good place to start the week. I'm joined by a very distinguished panel. First of all, we will be hearing from the Vice-Chancellor at Sheffield Hallam, Professor Sir Chris Husbands, who I'm sure will be known to many of you. And then we'll also hear from our panellists, Samita Jamdar from Shakespeare Martineau. Samita is Partner and Head of Education. Professor Simon Collinson, Deputy Pro-Vice-Chancellor at the University of Birmingham and also Director of the West Midlands Regional Economic Development Institute, and also from Alexis Cratchai from the Sheffield Chamber of Commerce. Alexis is Executive Director at the Chamber. So really interesting range of perspectives, really good panel. And of course, also these events are very much about you as participants joining in the discussion and the debate. You will find at the bottom of your screens the Q&A function. So please do open up the Q&A function. You can drop questions into the Q&A as we go along, and we'll also have some time dedicated to question and answer in the second half of the session. But please do feel free to drop questions into the Q&A as we go along. I'm going to hand over just in a minute to Chris. Chris is going to run through his initial introduction and presentation, take us through a few slides. If there are any questions that are specifically for Chris on his presentation, we may take those if they've come into the Q&A once Chris finishes speaking, but otherwise I think we'll take the opportunity to hear the perspectives of the panelists, and then we'll open up to a wider Q&A. Just a couple of final logistics before I hand over to Chris. Please do keep cameras and microphones switched off. As I've said, we are recording the session, and I hope we have a really interesting hour and a half. And Chris, on that note, I will hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Richard. Good to see my fellow panelists, and good to be here. I am just going to kick off with a very simple slide deck just to frame some issues from the perspective of higher education. What can universities bring to address the challenges of funding levelling up? And I'm going to start just by thinking a little bit about levelling up. Thank you. Can I have the next slide, Shireen? Thank you. So there's a really interesting strand of thinking emerging, which is really that levelling up, for all the sense that it's been described as the defining mission of this government, is under theorised as a sort of policy initiatives. And this slide just presents three slightly different ways of looking at levelling up. We can think of levelling up as an economic challenge in which it's about productivity and GVA, and it's certainly true that outside London and the southeast, GVA is low, and in South Yorkshire, where I work, it's extraordinarily low by national standards and has remained low since the Great Recession. We can also think of levelling up as a social challenge. It's about the resilience of places. It's about the high street resilience, it's about the social resilience of places and their ability to sustain rewarding and successful lives for a whole range of people on different trajectories. I think Michael Gove, in defining levelling up, said that levelling up would succeed if you did not need to leave the place that you loved in order to live the life that you wanted to live. And then we can also think of levelling up as a cultural challenge. It's about the perception we have of places, and it may often be about the self-perception of places. And I'm not going to make any reference whatsoever to an unfortunate phrase that a government minister might have used about two places beginning with B that she may or may not have visited last week. The point here is that levelling up covers a whole range of dimensions, and that means it's a cross-cutting challenge for government. We know that governments struggle with cross-cutting challenges. It's also a cross-cutting challenge for civil society, and I think of universities as institutions in civil society. And many of us, I think, are going to make the argument that universities have a critical part to play in levelling up through their teaching, through their research, through their civic engagement, through their wider activities. So I'm actually going to start in a slightly negative place. Next slide, Shireen, and argue that universities might be part of the problem. And there are two ways in which universities might be part of the problem. The first of them is that the distribution of universities in this country is non-rational. It's emerged from the past century and a half of higher education development. Sheffield has 2 universities, Leeds now has 5 universities, Wakefield has no university, Doncaster has no university, and so on and so on. And the difference in many cases between the vibrancy of urban economies in this country is closely related to whether or not they have the happy accident of hosting one or more universities. So the location of universities causes us a problem for levelling up. Causes us a problem in terms of the spend of universities, the spend of students, but also in relation to research activities, innovation activities, and so on. And that's exacerbated by the particular model that we have in higher education, in the UK, of higher education as a largely residential offer. Universities essentially in this country operate by moving young people from one part of the country to another part of the country. Almost every university in this country has a footprint which is slightly smaller than the footprint it claims to have. But the consequence of that is, as I say, that students move to go to university. And once they've moved, they tend to stay. There are graduate populations in Sheffield, in Cambridge, in Oxford, in Exeter, that are the stickiness of undergraduates staying in the place where they went to university and generating economies that flow from that. And since the universities are therefore part of the problem as well as part of the solution, any solution requires deliberative and purposive interventions. Something has to change if we want things to be different. Shireen. So looking at the white paper on levelling up, there are perhaps 4 things to say about it. The first is that it's a very cogent analysis, which demonstrates that at a very clear policy level, government does understand the cross-cutting nature of the levelling up challenge. I think the general view of academics is that the white paper is stronger on analysis than it is on policy prescription. Second thought from those of us who work in and lead universities is that it seems to seriously undercook the potential of universities. There are a number of things it could have said that it doesn't say, which rather suggests, at least implicitly, that the government believes that universities might be part of the problem as well as part of the solution. And that leaves us 2 questions. First of all, why is the white paper so unimpressive about the role of universities? And secondly, what could universities bring to the challenge of levelling up? Well, as I've just implied, it may be so unimpressive because government thinks that although universities have enormous potential, there are some quite difficult challenges in getting them to work in ways that are genuinely focused on spreading prosperity. Next slide, Shireen, and this is my last slide. So I offer 5 propositions that universities should think about when bringing their resources to the challenges of levelling up. The first is that universities need to take their role in place seriously, and especially in the way they relate to other places, the places that they are not located, as well as the places that they are located. I've read over the last 20 years any number of economic studies that demonstrate the consequential economic impact of universities on the towns in which they're located. And they're really interesting, but they are almost accidental. It's almost the crumbs from the table approach to higher education. We exist and we have this impact. I think that universities need to take their role in place much more seriously than that, to think about the way their supply chains, the way their procurement activities, the way their recruitment and staffing, the way their engagement with local authorities and other civil society institutions operate. And they have to think really hard about the way they relate to other places, not seeing other places as simply potential sources of student recruitment. The second thing to say is that current targets for place-based allocations of research and development funds that flow out of government's thinking about place are very conservative, and universities need to think hard about what the consequence of this is. I used to run a London institution, and I argued until I was blue in the face that quality is the only thing that should matter in the allocation of resource. Since I moved out of London, I slightly changed my view on that. I think the challenges of place are so deeply embedded that we need a deliberative change, a place-based approach to the allocation of research and development funding. The third is that funding incentives, the things that we ask institutions to do around their core purpose, can drive collaboration if they are designed to. I apologize for the typo on this slide. Funding incentives can drive collaboration if they're designed to. They can also drive competition. And at a time when resources are quite constrained, we need to make sure that funding arrangements force universities to think about their engagement with places other than those that they happen to be located. My fifth proposition is that although we're going to talk a lot in this presentation and this session about universities, the individual university might be the wrong frame. I think collaborations are really important. They may happen at the most strategic level of the university, a relationship between the University of Sunderland and the University of Teesside, for example, but they may be between departments or faculties or entities within universities. They may be individual relationships with community organisation. Collaborations matter, and they need to be driven hard, and we need to be permissive about the way that we support them. And my fifth point is a non-economic and almost a non-policy point. But the universities need to think hard about humility. I have to say that it's not something universities are terribly good at. They tend to think of themselves as highly successful organisations that bring success to places. And that's often true. But not everything universities do goes well. Not everything universities do is right. We need to work, if we're going to really be drivers of place and drivers of success, we need to listen hard to what places want. We need to listen hard to what places really want, and we need to bring humility as well as our other resources to bear. So those are my propositions. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand back to you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Chris. And I think you've opened up a whole set of questions there, which we could explore. But I think before we open it up to wider discussion, I think that's a really good point from which we might get some perspectives from our panelists. So I'm going to hand over initially to Samita. So Samita, great to hear from you on your views on this.
Thanks very much, Richard, and thanks very much, Chris. As is often the case, I'm in grave danger of violently agreeing with Chris in everything he says, except possibly one point, which I will just flag up at the end of my presentation. In answer to the question then, and in answer to the propositions that Chris put forward about what can universities bring, I think the first is absolutely their commitment on a strategic and long-term basis to understanding the needs of their place and to deciding how they can help to meet the needs of their place. And I just want to pick up a few parts of that. So the first is that strategic is something that will feature strongly in my remarks. And I think part of that means how do we make sure that governing bodies are also engaged in this as they're reviewing the strategy of the organisation and making sure they fully understand the role that the university could play in levelling up. Long term is something that will also figure in my remarks, and I suspect in the remarks of everybody else, because I think this is one of the reasons that the challenge of levelling up is almost too important to leave to governments alone. They're hooked on 5-year electoral cycles, and they're also hooked on the heady intoxication of quick, but sometimes very shallow policy wins. And we need to provide the counterpoint, which is long-term serious thinking about what's necessary. And then also, I think this idea of helping to meet, helping is absolutely crucial here. This is not about universities being saviors. This is about them being supporters of the communities and the places in which they sit. And this is also about how well they understand their place and its communities. And so I think that the capitals that were set out in the Levelling Up white paper are quite a good way of trying to assess where the place you're in sits in terms of the markers of successful places, and helping to then develop a plan for what the university could do to bridge any gaps. So that was my first point, strategic long-term commitments. Secondly, recognizing that what Levelling Up really needs is a lot of money, which is unlikely to be forthcoming. I think it's a question of universities determining how they can use the funds that they have and the activities that they already do on a much more strategic basis. So something like knowledge exchange is obviously key, but how do we make sure that we are genuinely meeting the needs of our place? Where do we get the most bang for our buck in the place? And how can we pool and share resources where necessary to ensure that the whole place benefits? My third point is that universities should think about how they can support empowered place-based decision-making, so that what money is there, what resources are there, they're being spread out in a properly targeted way that has maximum impact. And so this could be about using their clout, and they do still have a lot of clout, to influence how central government administers things like the Shared Prosperity Fund. How do we get that so that it is meeting local needs? Or it could be about helping local and regional decision-making to be as strong as it possibly can. And I think there's a question there about where should the university take a leadership role and where should it play that supporting role that I've talked about. Finally, collaboration, which Chris rightly mentioned, it can be the solution to so many things. It can be a way of attracting investment. So for example, the Northern Gritstone Investment Company. It can be a way of meeting skills gaps through partnerships with FE and with business. But it again needs to be a long-term commitment that transcends changes in leadership and changes within individual institutions. And I absolutely firmly believe that when we're thinking about levelling up, competition is not the key, but nor is opportunistic or transactional collaboration. The challenge is simply too big and too deep for posturing or for quick fixes, but it's absolutely ideal for long-term, serious democratic institutions like universities to get hold of. Now, before I hand back to Richard, I did say that I was going to tentatively disagree with Chris on a point. And this is to do with whether levelling up is about keeping people in the places they are. I am an inherent migrant. I have moved my whole life, and that has not stopped me from forming deep bonds with the places I'm in at the time and wanting them to succeed. So I think we have to be careful that this doesn't become an anywheres and somewheres distinction. I think this is about making sure that whatever the constitution of a place at a particular time, everybody benefits from wealth, health and prosperity. So thank you, Richard.
That's great. Thanks very much, Smita, and lots of really interesting points. And I think that point you make around the importance of universities taking a strategic long-term view, it's a theme that's come up in so much of the whole debate around the civic role of universities. And you know, at one level, it's really clear and straightforward point. At another level, we know how challenging many universities find that. So I think it's a really interesting point to test harder. Okay, great. Let's move on. I'm going to move on next to Simon Collins. And so Simon, great to hear from you now.
Many thanks, Richard, and morning everybody, and thanks very much to the Civic University Network for inviting me onto the panel. Really interesting topic. I'm going to try and focus on three related areas of regional funding, just to sort of categorize, I think, the areas that universities can play a constructive role. And I'll pick up from Chris Husband's excellent lead presentation. I think in all of these areas, the point is about being much more proactive and proactively focusing on the specific, quite different sometimes, needs of local stakeholders in trying to pull more funding into the region to grow inclusively. So the first area is where we've got a timely opportunity right now across universities, and this is to do with universities actually leveraging their own science and technology and their R&D expertise to do a couple of things. One is this is a way to attract more public and private R&D funding into city regions and regions everywhere, and then try and use that to drive emerging industry clusters, new clusters of creative or digital or low carbon startups. So the first thing is to bring more funding in to set up new types of industry clusters for long-term growth in regions, using universities as part of the catalyst. The second thing, though, there is to try and work a lot more closely with local firms and bridge the gap between the sort of top end of the funnel of science and technology, new inventions in universities, and the applied adoption in firms to improve processes, products, services, so that local firms become more innovative and more competitive. And again, that drives long-term growth. So this is an opportunity right now because, you know, some of this requires government pump priming, and we've got really quite significant opportunities from BEIS and UKRI, who've now got, as part of the Levelling Up agenda, an explicitly place-based investment delivery plan to push more money in terms of public R&D funding outside the Golden Triangle. We're one of 3 regions in the West Midlands alongside Manchester and Glasgow, currently talking about part of the 100 million investment in 3 innovation accelerators. And these are catalysts for particular areas of new growth. I think the really interesting thing about this is that this is a bit of an experiment in less of a transactional and contractual bidding process with central government for regional funds, and much more of a co-shaping relationship. So BEIS and Innovate UK are working very closely with us and regional authorities and in all 3 regions to try and actually understand more deeply which types of investments in regions from the public sector will drive more private sector growth funding in R&D intensive areas, and lead into a bit more precise investment from the shared prosperity funding. So that's the first area. And, you know, the idea there is to drive these innovative clusters and the longer term growth outside the southeast and London. The second area is to do with just pure private sector investment. And universities already work a lot in terms of, for example, attracting foreign direct investment. We're big sources of attraction for overseas investors, both in R&D and in skills programs in various other areas. And I think there's signs of universities working more closely with inward investment agencies, particularly in our area, and going on more trade missions and working with the CBI and others, again, to align the university proposition with local firms and foreign investors. But this basket of private sector investment into regions extends also all the way down to student incubators and bringing venture capital into regions, increasing startups and scale-ups through British Business Bank, or actually following the example of Northern Gritstone, which is a university collaboration in the north, currently landing 215 million to jointly commercialize the collective IP of regional universities. And I think that's a model that's going to be copied elsewhere. So universities clubbing together as a region to commercialize IP locally, using some public sector agencies to support that. And that's a big area. And those are just examples. I think lastly, the third illustration is pretty unusual, but it relates closely to the work we do at City Ready. And it is an important role of universities, particularly because regions have gone through what was effectively 3 economic shocks, from pandemic, past Brexit, and now the Ukraine situation. These are economic shocks that are hitting the low-skilled, low-income parts of our country most. And in terms of supporting a higher level of regional subsidy from central government, some of the work we did at City Ready, looking at Brexit impacts, highlighted the fact that high manufacturing areas, heavy manufacturing dependence in regions outside the southeast, particularly the West Midlands and the Midlands more generally, were being impacted much more heavily by Brexit, and they're getting impacted heavily by the Ukraine situation. So in a sense, by bringing intelligence and analysis on regional vulnerability and areas where regions are less resilient, and adding precision to the subsidies and support given by central government. In this particular instance, we brought in about 50% more funding from the Getting Building Fund from central government into the West Midlands to actually ameliorate the impacts of small firms going into insolvency with a knock-on effect to low-income households. You know, and that's not just an economic intervention, that's a social intervention. That is using analytical intelligence to basically point to the risk areas in regions that require a little more subsidy and support from central government at times of negative shock. So again, I think, again, coming back to Chris Husband's key point, finally, just to wrap up, I think perception about the positives or the potential positives and the potential negatives of regions outside the Southeast. I think universities can do a great deal on top of all the things I've just mentioned to improve perceptions globally and nationally, and improve the brand and the reputation and the fantastic opportunities that exist in regions, you know, to bring in funding and attract both international and national attention to these regions. So let me stop there, but I hope those three categories were clear and give you examples of where I think universities, again, can be proactive in supporting more funding to regions. Yeah, thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Simon. And again, lots there and lots of really interesting perspectives. I particularly like the emphasis you put on universities getting and regions getting into a co-shaping relationship rather than this kind of bidding reactive relationship, and perhaps something we might explore as we go on through the discussion. But actually, I think you've also, in a way, you've set things up quite nicely to hear from Alexis from a business perspective. So Alexis, as I said, from the Sheffield Chamber of Commerce, and Alexis, let me hand over now to you.
Thank you, Richard. I suddenly feel intimidated coming from the business community in front of an esteemed panel of academics and practitioners and an audience that I don't really know, but I will hopefully say something of note and attempt to be erudite. Just to contextualize my comments, as I've been introduced, I'm currently the Executive Director at Sheffield Chamber of Commerce, but I'm also, I think, a serial entrepreneur in that I have founded businesses, I run businesses, and I've also lost businesses. And along the way, I've collaborated with universities, both at a strategic sense, but also on a practical sense, in that one of my businesses was an occupier of a university laboratory for a few years. So in some ways, I've got very little to add to this thoughtful conversation, but I've got the practical on the ground experience of working with universities and thinking about how they can add value to place. I wanted to pick up on really a couple of points that Chris has introduced. One, very much focused around the role of universities in place, but my main role, and it's a self-appointed role, I've not been asked to do this, is to be somewhat provocative. Levelling up was first mentioned in the 19th century. We've been talking about this for centuries. It has been a topic of mainstream political conversation for 50 years. You only have to go and ask Michael Heseltine. So it's not to be critical or to be disrespectful, but it's just to acknowledge this is not a new conversation. What's merely happening is we're reframing the language in contemporary times. So there's an element of Groundhog Day about this. And I did say it at an event a few months ago, which got a ripple of applause, but I may not get it now. But every time levelling up is mentioned, I fear a fairy dies somewhere in that. So we should be honest. We should be honest. Where to begin? Where to begin? Chris framed it very nicely. I'm based in Sheffield. I'm based in South Yorkshire. I'm born and raised here. Chris set it out very well. I'll be a little more candid. In South Yorkshire, I live and work in a low-paid economy, a low-skilled economy, and an economy that's been beset by low levels of investment for decades, not years, for decades. We talk about at the moment the competition that exists for funding. We talk about the nuances of funding, but we're dealing with some systemic and structural problems, not just in South Yorkshire, but let's be honest, predominantly outside of the southeastern London. And the conversation that we're having is hugely important, and I think the universities have a role to play, which, dare I say, I think is way more significant than perhaps it's been framed so far this morning. And I wanted to just spend a few moments describing why I think that's the case. The white paper, the Levelling Up white paper, and I say this evidently with tongue in cheek, reminded me of one of the essays I wrote at university when I didn't know what I was writing about. So I padded out my word count with things that I thought might be of interest to the reader and left all the difficult bits a gap. And largely Chris has identified this in his remarks, in his opening remarks. The white paper pads out a huge number of pages describing things that we knew already and that government knows already, and that, lo and behold, surprisingly or not, levelling up is a cross-cutting issue. Blow me down with a feather. Never did I think it was such an issue. But it's light on policy. What a surprise, because we've been talking about this for 50 years and we've been trying various things on the periphery of the edges, but there's been no real serious address in this paper to figure out what we might do. Because, and this is my assertion, there is an elephant in the room. Government is clearly different from running a business, and running a business is nothing like running government. But I know that if a business is failing, trying to make slightly different decisions in a boardroom very rarely is successful. You have to question the entire premise of how the business is structured and how the business is run. And I put to you this morning that that's what I think we need to do when we think about levelling up. We need to question the whole structure of the business of how we run this country. And we need to have a serious conversation about how, and I don't say this from a provocative standpoint, I say it from a point of looking at the facts on the ground. We have to have a serious conversation about how we deconstruct the most centralized state in the Western world. Our economy is weak and growing weaker. Our economy is the least productive in the Western world. I could go on and on and on. And if that was a business, the business owners would be seriously questioning the structure of that business. And so in the final few minutes that I've got to speak, I'm going to put to you as an outsider to the Civic University Network. A, I am hugely grateful for the invitation this morning. And B, I think this is hugely important work that you're doing collaborating. But I lay a challenge at your door. Because Chris asked me to. At the end of his presentation, he said, what could universities bring to the challenge? I need you to fix this. The country needs you to fix this. The reason being is that we have to now, I think, as a country, find the confidence, the intellectual rigor, and perhaps the agitation to really question whether or not we can carry on doing what we're doing when we have a centralized state as we do. And that is not to pick a fight with the current government or the preceding government or the government that might come after 2024 or 2025. We all have a stake in recognizing that the way we run this country doesn't work for the majority of the people who call this country home. And so I ask the University Network and for you to do three things that you do impeccably well. More analysis. The state doesn't work. Let's talk about that in a thoughtful way, and let's talk about it boldly. Agitation. The history that I know, which is limited, tells me that our universities are a hotbed of change over the centuries. We need agitation, not necessarily protest and riot yet, but we need, with the networks, the alumni, the participants in the public debate, to start agitating for the reality of the fact that our state does not work. And that is a sets problem for central government as much as local government and communities. And last but not least, to conclude, alliances. And this is why I think the Civic University Network is so important. If we're going to have a grown-up conversation in this country about the fact that this country is run on a flawed premise, we're going to need alliances. And I cannot think of a better set of institutions to be able to draw those alliances together. I accept Chris's point about the fact that universities aren't located on a rational basis, but I can think of no other network that is able to have the conversation that we need to have. It can't be the business community. We're too busy generating jobs and trying to generate profit to pay taxes. And it won't come from our local authorities, and it won't come from central government. And so as a final comment from me, I think it's up to the university network to fundamentally change how the country is run. And I know you're up for the challenge. Thank you very much.
Well, it's a great challenge, Alexis, and you may not have got a round of applause given that everyone's on mute, but I've seen some thumbs up and lots of nodding. So thank you, and you've framed the challenge. You've framed the challenge.
Well, here it comes. Here come the applause.
You're all very kind. You're very kind.
So look, thank you, and I'm just gonna start really by taking up the challenge that Alexis has thrown down. I'll come back initially to Chris and then perhaps to Simon and Smita as well. This session is very deliberately headed what universities can bring to the challenge of funding levelling up, because of course it is quite easy for universities to do one of the three things, Alexis, which you talked about, which is analyse. It's quite easy for universities to tell other people what they should do, but this session is not just about us analysing and advising. It is about what do we actually do, and indeed that's what the Civic University Network is all about. And some of the things we've talked about as we've gone through this session, some of the challenges for universities, some of the, the importance of a strategic approach, a long-term approach, of engaging with partners, of working collaboratively, again, are things that have been said before. Let's be honest, they're things that many of us know about ourselves and our sector, but they are still challenges for us. So that challenge you throw down at the end, Alexis, come on, it's time for the sector really to step up and change the country and change our places, is what I'm going to throw back initially to Chris and the other panelists, just to respond to that a little bit more directly. So Chris, let me come to you first.
Right, well, it was a great presentation, Alexis, and not for the first time you've G'd me up. I'm actually going to say where to start. Probably two or three things, aren't there? The first is I think you're wrong about the 19th century. I have to confess that my my PhD, which is a very, very long time ago, was about regional unevenness in development in the late 17th century. And so we could probably dig further back, but there is a difference, and I'm going to make a serious point. There is a difference. I've told this story like a couple of times. Just before the lockdown, went off to Worksop to look at this National Trust curated place called Mr. Straw's house, which is one of those houses that had the same resident for most of the 20th century and was unchanged from the beginning of the 20th century. And in the reception room, there are photographs of Worksop in the early 20th century, and it's a very vibrant, the high street is busy, people are working, there's a whole range of local businesses. So the economy in the early 20th century was generating success for the populace in a way that the economy in many places at the beginning of the 21st century is not. And I think that's one of the things that underpins this. You're absolutely right, of course, that the Levelling Up white paper, does indeed read like an undergraduate essay with a bit of 16th century Italy thrown in just to give a veneer of a book that somebody might have read. So where to start? I do think three things. The first is that the title of this session is correct in one respect, because it's about universities plural. This is not about what one university does. It's not about what the University of Uttoxeter or wherever else does. It's about how universities can work together. And we do have, it's a point to remember, a pretty diverse higher education sector. Universities have quite different structures and quite different priorities. So I think there's a really interesting question about how we, on the basis of mutual respect, and to be absolutely frank, a mutual respect which is too often lacking in quite a lot of our discourse, think about how we work together in the best interests of the people of this country. The second is that over the last 40 years, 60 years, universities have had pretty robust funding arrangements. They've been in a pretty privileged position, and by virtue of a decision made in 2011 by the coalition, they were by and large spared the challenges of austerity, the rest of the public sector. My view is that creates an obligation on universities to think about others. We've had it, people like me who run universities, so it's terribly difficult, it's really hard. Actually, it's incredibly easy compared to what it's been like to run a local authority. And I think that we ought to be much more serious about our obligations. So plural obligations. And then just to reiterate Smita's opening points about long term, you've got to stick at things for the long term. This is not about hit and run. And if you operate on a corner shop basis, you're not going to get that.
Thanks, Chris. Let me just see whether Simon actually might want to. I mean, Simon, you've done a lot of work through WM Ready and City Ready, looking at what is happening in different places and how well coalitions are working. And just wonder whether you've got any reflections on how to actually make these things happen.
Yeah, I mean, Alexis makes good points. I'm slightly nervous about killing more fairies in the sense that this is a massive challenge, and he's absolutely right. The funding level, the policy interventions, none of them are radical or big enough. There's no question, and that this isn't a new challenge in a sense that this is why we've been trying to do this for over 100 years, because over that time we've become more centralized. Power and funding has become more centralized, and the policy of allocating funding to regions has become more politicized. So that's a dilemma in itself, given the state of politics. I guess one pushback, simply because I see a lot of, and I'm focusing on the slightly optimistic or opportunistic side of this, a slight pushback is, I got the impression Alex was saying that the universities should take first responsibility and firms just should get on with making profits and giving jobs. And in a sense, he's shaking his head, so I'd love to hear him come back on that. I have seen some real excellent progress in coalitions and collaborations at the regional level, partly overcoming the dysfunctionality that we have with regional governance structures. LEPs, combined authorities, local authorities, councils, all having blurred sets of responsibilities and all, to some extent, battling each other for small amounts of central government funding. And what I've seen cut through that is actually coalitions that involve large and small private sector players who are committed. And they're committed to making a contribution that is a civic contribution, because some of them are starting to consider themselves as anchor institutions. That means dedicated to their place and actually dedicated to the communities in their place. And some of this is PR, but some of it is genuinely investment of time and resources into real programs on the ground that either improve access to employment through upskilling local communities, or are working on sustainability, or are working on infrastructure to help communities that are disconnected from where the jobs are in regions. So I'm not going to get into specific examples, but I think my point is that business can't just get on with the business of business. Business has got to be part of the player with universities and with regional authorities to help this. So again, he's right, not enough, not radical enough. We don't want to kill fairies, but in a sense, I think business is part of the solution here.
Right, Alex, I'll come back to you in a minute, because I think you were shaking your head, and I have to just give you the right to reply. But Samit, just before I do any perspectives from you.
I think I was thinking about the challenge that Alexis put down there. And in addition to everything that's been said, the two words that kept coming to my mind were leadership and autonomy. And I think that, it's very easy for institutions to feel rather browbeaten and cowed. There's a lot of attacks going on universities at the moment. But ultimately, you remain one of the most autonomous parts of our civic infrastructure. You have got that capacity to show real leadership. And I think that's where, some of those challenges that Alexis threw down, they're not going to be fixed quickly, but the conversation has to come from evidence-based research, analysis, and so on. So I just really emphasize the absolute critical importance of institutions embracing and valuing their own autonomy and leadership, showing leadership to the country at a time when we desperately need it.
Yeah, and we're touching into a couple of the questions that have been asked, and please do keep dropping questions into the Q&A. I'll just take us on into those in a moment or two. But Alexis, just let me just give you the chance if you want to come back again, particularly on the role of business.
Thank you, Richard. Simon, you're absolutely right to call me out. I overly simplified an argument. That I was going to go down of one of two routes. The simple one is say, oh, business is here to just create jobs and generate profit. I don't think that's the case at all, but I thought I was trying to be brief, and that's what happens when you go for brevity over accuracy. In Sheffield, 88% of businesses employ 9 or less people. That's not exceptional in terms of the UK economy. So when we talk about business, the UK PLC is run on micro-sized businesses that really have to that find it difficult on an individual basis to come together to play a civic role. For what it's worth, that's why I used to have hair before taking over Sheffield Chamber of Commerce. That's one of the things I've set out to do with colleagues, is try and build a Chamber of Commerce back to how they were a century or so ago as a leadership organisation. The point about LEPs is well made, but it was just to acknowledge that universities university networks have a scale where that you can have an impact hugely in the place in a way that the business community finds it hard to do at the moment, because we do, by and large, in this country, lack strong private sector-led organizations like you might find in Germany, for example. That was the more kind of thoughtful point I was trying to make. So you're right to challenge me about tax, and we're not there just to create jobs, but it's just to acknowledge that the business ecosystem in this country is made up of millions and millions of tiny businesses, and drawing them together to create the scale and the impact that universities can have is clearly a huge task that probably will beat anybody.
Yeah, no, I think, and it's a very fair point in a number of regional settings, not least, as you say, South Yorkshire. I'm going to come to the question that John Goddard asked a few minutes ago, and it is, I guess, taking us into this challenge of when we talk about place and when we talk about the groups of actors that make things happen in place. That's not always straightforward. It can be pretty complex, and we'll all have our scars of trying to work collaboratively and constructively. So let me just so John's particularly talking about the fact that the system locally may not be clearly defined, may not have legal status. So how does public accountability to place play out when it's not really part of how universities are funded and regulated? And I suppose to some extent this goes to this challenge, and perhaps might come to Chris first on this, of how do we get universities really to prioritise their accountability to place? It's easy to talk about, it's easy to have it as a nice thing to do, but what really shifts the dial for you and other vice chancellors on this? What more do we need to do to make that feel real?
Thanks, Richard, and thanks, John. It is a really important question, and if I had a sort of clear answer to it, I'd probably, well, if I had a clear answer to it, I'd give a clear answer to it. So I'm going to give a slightly confused answer. A bit like some of those undergraduate essays that the Levelling Up white paper was modelled on. I think there's a couple of things. The first is that I do think we've got to be completely blunt about this. That there are some universities who do not primarily think of themselves as having obligations to place. They think of themselves as primarily facing an international peer group of institutions. And they're always going to be like that. And it's probably just accepting that as a fact of life. It's a small number of institutions in this country. It's probably a total of 2, to be honest, but they do have a quite significant impact on the way in which the second tier of institutions think about their potential relationships with place. And I don't think we should understate the things that flow from that in our system. So that's sort of factor into it. There's a point that I was going to make, and I've forgotten it in the course of making the first one. So I'm just going to sort of for a minute. So I'm going to let me come back when I've
let me see if others, because we'll all have our own experience of this kind of complexity of place and making accountability and incentives really feel aligned. I just wonder whether any of the other panelists want to chip in on that. Samita.
I suppose this was something we looked and thought about quite a lot during the Civic University Commission, where we were looking at how do you actually incentivize what in that context we were looking at as a civic agenda, but it could equally be translated to a broader, other place-based way of looking at things. And I think we came up with a, in some ways, you've got to go back to what you were set up for. And most institutions at their heart were universities of a place. They weren't just, there by chance. They were set up as the university of somewhere. And the fact is that what we should be questioning is how did we lose sight of that? Not how do, is it an important part of who we are? It's an absolutely crucial part of who we are. Some institutions may have, over a period of time, lost a little bit of sight of it, but most, I think, recognise the need to reclaim it. And then just 2 other quick points on it. The first is that if we don't have funding, law or regulation making us do something, how autonomous are we if we still then cannot do it? So we have to embrace the freedom given to us by our own autonomy and create our own accountabilities to the communities we serve. And then the final point, which is a really small, techie, nerdy legal point, is that the OFS is actually starting to indicate that as part of its strategy, it's going to look at the contribution that graduates make to the local economy. I know that's a very small part of what we're talking about, but it is the sign that even the regulators are sort of getting their head round the fact that there is a sort of place-based element to high-performing institutions. I'll stop there.
Yeah, Simon, you want to chip in? I might ask you a direct question, but let me just see what you were going to say first. But I'm interested.
Okay. No, I'm just following on from Smita's really excellent points. I think there are several areas. One is actually filling gaps. I mean, there is a gap in regional capacity and capability because so much of capacity and capability for understanding regions and for delivering changes is centralized in London. And one of those gaps is analysis. That's what we do at City Ready, which is analyzing what is the real competitive advantage of this place, what industries could grow here, what investments could we attract, but also what interventions should policymakers make to make the biggest difference from small amounts of public funding. I think the second thing is actually supporting through, relatively neutral convening power is bringing together different agencies, because the public sector tends to battle with itself. The private sector has agency and profit, but we are relatively neutral and we can convene different groups to come together and to come up with a consensus about what the best interventions are. Where are the investments we would collaborate in to bring to a region, and convene those groups, and then to some extent help deliver interventions, because we're very large anchor institutions. We can work with the biggest and the smallest in the region. But that's about filling gaps. And I would like to see longer term, resources coming out of central government that would help capacity building within regions that goes well beyond universities. It shouldn't all, the money shouldn't come to universities. We do pretty well. Clearly, we'd want a part of it, but it's got to go into supporting improved productivity in small businesses, industry clusters that will grow long-term innovation in regions that will help them be self-sufficient in the longer term. And so you've got to sidestep some of the current governance blocks and get on with it at the local level, I think.
Yeah. Simon,
sorry, did you have another question on top?
I'm going to take the liberty of asking you a question directly about the University of Birmingham. So I guess just stepping back a little bit, just to hear, I suppose, how some of these debates and challenges play out for the institution, because you are, University of Birmingham, big, long-standing institution. And I guess in a way you probably fall into the category that Chris was alluding to of, an organization with a strong international profile. I'm just picking up the second question actually we've got there from Alan, which goes to this challenge of does an internationalized student market, how compatible is that with local? So just be really interesting to hear how do these issues play out when you're sitting around the table of the senior leaders in Birmingham? How does the sense of responsibility to place fit with being a national and international institution?
It's a really good question and something we've talked about a lot. And historically, that's us. I mean, going back to Alex's point about long term, Chamberlain set us up as a civic university well over a century ago as the city mayor. So it's in our DNA. I think there's an interesting finessing about global and civic, but of our 6 pillars of the main strategy of the university, global and civic are connected together. And one of those things is bringing international research to bear on local problems. So it's the fact we're a global, top 100 university and we do top class research. We apply that research locally. So Tyseley, our energy centre in low carbon fuels, is getting the best research around the world and applying it locally. Secondly, those students. I mean, students are a wonderful source through alumni networks and for our overseas teaching. We have a campus in Dubai. We do a lot of stuff in Singapore. The alumni over the last 50 years are basically potential future inward investors into the region. And if you're looking at Asia, China, Indian investors, we actively work with the city mayor, the leadership. The vice chancellor has just been to Toronto on a trade mission. And part of that is connecting with alumni. And part of it is connecting our R&D with potential investments from other parts of the world that will gel, with what firms in our region want. But you're right, it's a difficult thing because every university wants to proclaim itself as global. And in some eyes, being local is parochial. Yeah, it's not ambitious, global, big. And I think that's a problem that we're getting over. I think actually we're connecting those two things in a much better way. And there are other exemplars of how well places do this beyond Birmingham. I don't want to overstress the Birmingham example, but we've been grappling with it for a long time.
Yeah, I think that point around local not being parochial is a really interesting way of framing it, and it takes us potentially into one of the next questions. But Chris, you've got your hand up.
Well, it was just to pick up. One of the finesses I'd put on Simon's point is the need for institutions then to work with other local institutions. The University of Birmingham plays a particular part in the economy of Birmingham. Birmingham City plays a slightly different part, and Aston plays another. And I think but your question to me at the beginning, which was how can vice chancellors do this? I think this sense of working generously with other institutions across the sector, beyond the sector, and Alex is in civil society is just incredibly important. The more you focus inwardly, the less successful you're going to be as a driver of success for your place.
Let's just follow up on this point around how do we make local feel exciting and significant and on a par with international, because I think I'm quite taken with the way you frame that, Simon, and I'm going to link this in, I think, with slightly tangentially with the question that Ed Bridges has asked, which is, do people outside London understand so there's something here about do we understand the challenges facing parts of the country outside the southeast? There's something about making those challenges feel really central and exciting and vibrant and as important as anything that we do. Alexis, I'm gonna just come back to you, if I may, on this. Just how do we make? And you had the challenge of saying we've been talking about this forever and we're still talking about it. So what from your perspective gets this gets this to sound more than a difficult, nice to have thing?
I've led with my chin here by saying what I've said, in that the questions and the challenges boomerang back, and rightly so. Just picking up on the question, do people, do stakeholders, do opinion formers and decision makers in London understand the challenges in the regions? No, but why would they? If they're not of this place. It's not about being identity politics, but I don't know much about the challenges and issues that are faced by the Spanish state or Spanish regions, because I'm based in the UK. And it comes back to, for me, it's not to seek quarrel with anybody or anything, but asking London and actors in London to answer questions that they're not capable of answering, because the challenges that we face in the regions are so complicated that however thoughtful and erudite people might be in writing or in meetings, they just can't be described. And so I go back to this point about deconstructing the centralized state so that more decision making is made in the regions. And I just briefly, if I may, just as an example of trying to lead by example, there may well be participants in this event this morning who are familiar with the central government policy around local skills improvement plans, LSIPs. Here in South Yorkshire, the three chambers in Sheffield, Barnsley, Rotherham and Doncaster have collaborated to be one of 8 trailblazing employer representative bodies who have just developed an LSIP for South Yorkshire. I won't bore you with the details of that plan or that process, but what underpins our work is a very simple ask. How do we get to a point where the most important politician when it comes to skills in South Yorkshire is not the Secretary of State in Whitehall, but rather the Metro Mayor, who's currently Oliver Coppard? And it's because now, and I raise that because as chambers, we have every incentive to try and wrestle away the development of skills policy from the city region structures to the chambers of commerce. That would make us feel good, it will make us feel proud, and we'll probably get paid to do it. But we're not qualified to do it. So all the work that we're doing is underpinning the analysis and the agitation that's needed to say to central government, here is an offer that you cannot refuse. and offer to take responsibility, not just for the adult education budget, but the entirety of skills funding. So that the decision on how that can be made by local actors, politicians, universities, and the business community. So I probably have strayed away from the question, but the point being is perhaps we in regions are asking policymakers at a national level questions that they cannot answer. And maybe what we need to do is create an environment where those answers arrive from decisions made locally. And that's why I keep coming back to this point about, in a non-agitational way, how can we work together to deconstruct the centralized state? Because it is exhausting everybody, including those who work in it.
Thanks. Smita, perhaps I might come to you next. I mean, you've been a key member of a number of national groups that have looked at different aspects of the role of universities in the civic agenda and more broadly. I was wondering, do you see green shoots here, or are we still hitting this kind of brick wall of London-centric governance?
Well, I think that London, people in London, and certainly universities in London, would say they are not the beneficiaries of any great London-centric decision-making, because they have been at the front line of stripping things like the London weighting and so on. So, the view is that levelling up could easily be a question of levelling down London to the level of everybody else, which is clearly not what we want to do. I mean, I think the challenge we've got here is that government does feel like it's made a potentially breakthrough step in establishing a department that's trying to look across, as its role, look across a range of government activities. But that is being set against a really strong centralisation push. Everything is about mistrust of the regions, not allowing devolution to really take hold, because it undermines the power of the centre. So I'm really, I'm a natural optimist. And I do think that if we can do more of what Alexis is talking about, which is modelling solutions in our regions that are almost sitting in parallel, you can at least then tap into that bit of government that's interested in place, as the departments of levelling up, etc., and say, right, these are some solutions that you can now take back to the rest of government and say, well, this does actually work. None of which really kind of is the solution, because the solution, as Alexis said at the very beginning, is a fundamental restructuring of our state. But that's not going to happen quickly. But maybe if we show these little examples of where it does work, and I don't mean little in a dismissive sense, but from government's point of view, small scale solutions, then maybe we have got a chance of persuading somebody that more of this needs to happen.
Yeah, and I think we've got a number of questions that probably go to this, and I guess as well as exposing some of the bigger challenges, part of the role of universities and part of the role of the network is to demonstrate what works, use that as a catalyst for stronger partnerships in more regions, and to make the case increasingly compelling. I think Chris, you rightly said at the beginning, universities can be seen as part of the problem in this, and we do have a responsibility. So there's a couple of questions which I'll come. Chris, I think you want to come in a minute, but I'll just particularly draw attention to the question from Keith in the Q&A, which is, it is kind of going to that practical question of given fragilities of long-term investment in regions and universities, what is it that universities can do to best nourish trust-based relationships with key stakeholders? There's a blog which I'm sure people will have a chance to have a look at, but just some either on that or indeed if you want to pick up something from what Smita was talking about. Let me hand over to you.
Well, thanks. I mean, Keith, I think the answers. The answer is there's no simple solution here, and I think that we are going to keep coming back to some fairly repetitive themes. It's about just building long-term relationships and looking for long-term sustainable funding. And I think there is a weakness in the system that universities have tended to think of themselves as conduits to various sources of public funds, and we're going to have to work our way around in a different sort of environments, but keep at it is the story. I mean, I think that just Richard, drawing you as the ringmaster into the debate a bit. You say that build the relationships, build the networks to make the case, and I think that does take us some far. Alexis's challenge is a more fundamental one. It's about, should the session have been called what is the role of universities in dismantling the British state? And we might have had but slightly more seriously, we do clearly have a massively over-centralized system. And in that respect, although there's loads of interesting stuff in the white paper, the levelling up white paper rests on the assumption that it is a central government that will rearrange its policy dynamic in order to even out some of the disparities that have arisen as a result of 40 years of failure of regional policy. Well, it's going to take us some way, but it's probably not going to take us all the way. So that's back to Keith's question. How do you do it? You keep working at it, and you keep building productive relationships, and you just keep at it. We'll lose some and we'll win some. Yeah.
Simon, you've got your hand up.
Oh, thanks very much. Just to pick up a few of those points, I think starting with the devolution issue, we are the most centralized economy in the whole of the OECD, both in terms of fundraising powers and fund spending powers. And unfortunately, what that means is that, again, capacity and capability have gravitated towards the center. And there is some really interesting international work, particularly by Andre Rodriguez-Posse at LSE, that shows that more inclusive growth happens in countries where there is more devolved powers, because it taps into self-interest in understanding where to intervene to grow regions better. And we've lost that. Since the RDAs disappeared, the regional development authorities in particular, we've become more dependent on central authorities knowing something about local regions. So I think that's a really important point. It's such a big issue to tackle given central government at the moment that I kind of sidestep it a little bit. And if we focus on the relationship issue, which is a really good one, I think there are two things there. One answer is around universities shifting more towards talking less about their outputs and more about outcomes, which benefit other people. Because we're very fond of talking about citations and our position in the rankings and saying how good our science and technology is. We need to pick up a bit more of a narrative around the fact that what we do benefits others, students included. But what is it those beneficiaries need right now from us? What are the stakeholder challenges that we can bring solutions to? So we need to be more stakeholder-led. And we need to start with what is the problem of a LEP, or what is the problem for a local firm, rather than we're doing this research. So I think that's the first issue about relationships. It's got to be balanced and led by their problems. I think the second thing is slightly more instrumental. And this is where the opportunity in some of the R&D funding coming down the channel is. Universities are instrumental in the sense they need to maintain their own business model. Now, if funding from UKRI or BAYS pushes even more, following on from Strength in Places funding, pushes even more collaboration and even more evidence and evaluation of the local impacts of our research, and funding is dependent on evidencing that impact, we will collaborate more with private sector and local authorities to make that happen, because part of our funding, a growing amount of our funding, might be predicated on that collaborative model. And I think that's being instrumental, another driver for improved relationships locally.
Good. Alexis and Smita, you both want to come in.
Thank you, Richard. Just picking up on Chris's point, not least to defend the accusation I've come and spoken at the wrong panel. No, I do. My remarks come back to funding.
Yeah.
Because we presuppose that everything that we're talking about is in an environment that's fixed. And my argument is it doesn't have to be. Is that, and Sunita's picked up this point as well. The issues I'm talking about are hugely profound and long-term. Just as how European energy policy was hugely profound and long-term and fixed until it got changed quite quickly. Same with regards to German foreign policy that got changed in a weekend. Now, I'm not trying to compare what's happening in Eastern Europe and Ukraine with what we're talking about this morning. That would be grossly inappropriate. My point being is that sometimes pressure mounts over a short period of time where fundamental changes become mainstream very quickly. And my argument is that it's underpinned by this sense that pressure is building in our system, in our politics, and in our society, in our economy. That means in the next few years, I think there will be a profound change, and that we need to be ready for that. Ready with the argument that perhaps it is time for the UK to think seriously about fiscal federalism on a regional basis. Not making the case now, but being ready to make the case when that window of opportunity arrives. Not to get drawn into these, and recognizing they're sensitive points that will be debated by politicians and academics. Scottish nationalism and Welsh nationalism is on the rise. We have an issue on the island of Ireland. We have a state in England that's not delivering for the vast majority of its population. We are coming off a high point of globalization, we have done for a decade. We're faced with a climate crisis. You take all of those together, there are some big, big pressures in our system that we call society. And my argument is that I think they will all give rise in the next 2 to 3 years to a point where topics that have been on the periphery of the debate for decades may become central very quickly. And I think one of those will be the fiscal settlement in the UK. And how do we, and if that's right, how can universities with the business community and local politicians and central government who are predisposed to this idea start to create the conditions where we collectively and harmoniously deconstruct the centralized state, because it doesn't work for anybody. But in the meantime, of course, we have to look at funding, but that all presupposes that the system in which we operate is a constant. And my argument is it doesn't have to be, and it is unlikely to be.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really timely reminder, and you know, you've given some great examples of how the world has fundamentally changed overnight on so many issues. And of course, one of the things about universities is they can feel oddly conservative and cumbersome institutions, while nevertheless professing some quite radical views as well. And I think that sense of how can universities see themselves as radical actors, as well as simply conservative institutions that think interesting things. Yeah, for me, that's one of the challenges, and I guess perhaps one of the opportunities that you're pointing to, Alexis, that we've got to really challenge ourselves to think outside the box in terms of what we can do as whole institutions. I'm going to come in, Smita, I will come to you just to then say I'll perhaps draw together the last 2 or 3 questions and invite any final comments from panelists. But just before I do that, Smita, I'll come back to you.
Yeah, I mean, the conversation may have moved on, so I'm sorry if I'm dragging it back, but Keith's question was very much about trust, wasn't it? It was about how do we create that trust? And, you know, it seems to me that it's in the same way that as individuals create trust, institutions need to show their credibility, their reliability, make people feel part and safe to discuss these issues, and then demonstrate that it's not all about self-interest. And actually, all of those things ought to be really easy for universities to do, because of, you know, who you are, what you do, the fact that your charities, you know, the vast majority of universities, you're not about self-interest. So it's almost going back to that core of, are we actually living the things that the values that we profess? Because if we are, we ought to be able to generate trust and build that long-term, you know, partnership working with as many actors as we need.
Yeah, no, I think they're really important points, and if not us, then who is going to grab some of this? Let me, I'm just going to, I think as we've gone through, I've been conscious of the questions in the Q&A. I think we've touched on most of them, but I will just, I'll just note the ones that are still left open in the chat. I think we have picked up the point around kind of tensions of international and local, Alan's question, and John has talked about how do universities rise above the mess of territorial governance structures. I think again we've touched on that, but if anyone wants to come back on that, then we will do so. And then Eliza, yeah, I think you know, a point which goes to the heart of the kind of narrative about universities and who we are and what role we play. Any reflections on how the kind of central communications teams and narratives within universities can play a role in addressing challenges? And perhaps goes to some of the points we've talked about in terms of how do universities describe themselves? Do they describe themselves as global institutions focused on, you know, what is the narrative about a big institution? So I'll invite any final comments on that, but also just any final reflections. I'll perhaps come, Chris, to you last. So I'll just flip back through perhaps Simon, Alexis, Smita, and then Chris, see if you want to draw together any final comments. Simon, anything else you want to pick up?
Yeah, no, I think in terms of partly comms and partly evidencing our contribution, I think there is some interesting experiments under the knowledge exchange framework, KEF. Now, whether you impose these sorts of things on universities and push them to evidence their contribution, or whether you take a slightly lighter line through creating positive relationships around the net benefits universities provide. Either way, I think it is, and we do quite a lot of work on this, it is interesting to try and not only evidence your contribution, through, how many business startups do you create, how much pro bono law services do you provide to the city centre, and these are all things we do, but actually specifically, how is that progressing? How is that improving over time? How are we growing that contribution? I think in that sense, the Civic University Network is a real asset, because we have a kind of network where we can compare across universities. All universities are in a different position. We all start from different starting points. We all have different volumes and different types of interactions with our regions, but in some ways, setting a foundation base and trying to encourage universities to do more and evidence the fact they're not just doing the same things, but actually they're improving both the precision of their contribution to meet external needs, but they're also doing more and more over time. And I think that's, again, whether you monitor it formally and pin funding to it, or you metricize it, is less relevant than finding ways just to encourage, in a positive sense, universities to play that role more proactively in the future.
Yeah, thanks so much, Simon. Just Alexis, any final reflections?
Beyond saying thank you for humouring me this morning, a practical suggestion or a real point of focus for all of this kind of deconstructing, again, said without malice, Her Majesty's Treasury. In 1997, the Labour government came into power and did something that was regarded as heretical to many. In the blink of an eye, they made the Bank of England independent. Now we're at a moment in time in 2022 where people are beginning to question whether or not that decision needs to be reversed. So maybe this is the time that we have a conversation about what does the future of Her Majesty's Treasury look like? Because as I see it, and it's not to create enmity, the regions have a problem around funding. Different sectors in society, the university network has a problem about funding. Businesses have a problem about the Treasury, not just necessarily seen through taxation, but just the Treasury, the Treasury, the Treasury. And the Treasury seems to have a problem with the Treasury in that they're saying, we have run out of ideas and the fiscal position does not look particularly positive. So I go back to how I began. I run, start, and I've lost businesses. If a business is not doing what it needs to be doing, yes, maybe change some people in the boardroom, but most of the point, change the structure of the business. And perhaps over the next couple of years, the universities, yes, can analyse, yes, can agitate, but can lead the charge in asking some fundamental questions about the role of Her Majesty's Treasury, because it can be changed in the blink of an eye, just as the Bank of England's role was in 1997.
Thank you very much. And Smita.
I just wanted to pick up the final question about communication, because again, one of the things that really struck out to me when we did the Civic University Commission was we would hear the most fantastic examples of things that universities were doing in the evidence sessions, and then people from the same institutions would come up at the end and say, I didn't know we did that. And looking again at the contributions that people have made to the chat, there are great examples coming through. So I don't know what the answer is, but I do know that unless you can communicate, as Simon said, the value of what you're doing, you might as well not be doing it at all in the current world, because everything is about persuading people to support the things that you're trying to do. So we have got to find a way of capturing the value of the projects, whether it's the long-term stuff that Alexis has been talking about, or whether it's sort of projects that are affecting people in the here and now, and really communicating that. And I think, again, Civic University Network is a fantastic resource for that. And I'm really, really grateful that it's been set up and is being supported in this way.
Fantastic. Thank you, Smita. And Chris, just let me give the final word to you.
Well, it really has been a really interesting session, and I've been scribbling notes away throughout. I'm going to end with something that I think is probably just worth remembering it's a sort of plus and a challenge. Universities are not tightly cohesive, centrally managed organizations. They are, you know, big baggy jumpers of organizations. I'm going through this cycle at the moment of meetings with departmental leadership teams across Sheffield Hallam. And this morning, 9 o'clock this morning, meeting with our computer science department, doing absolutely fantastic stuff in working with local firms that I didn't know about, because it's going incredibly well, and it's the problems that tend to land on my desk. And the point I make here is that many of the things that universities do happen ambiently across the organization. The job of people like me, I think, is to create an environment in which people are asking the right questions about collaboration, about their relationships with place, and are then empowered and supported to do it. And the reason I think that's important is that I suspect that the most interesting things in our relationships with places might not come from a central strategic decision. They'll be bubbling up through the ways in which we steer, or they're not single organizations. The very best you can say is they're fleets of boats that you're sort of steering through.
Thanks very much, Chris. Just looking at all the comments and inputs in the chat, I think some really interesting examples and comments, and I hope everyone's had a chance to look at those, or will do. Look, as ever with these sessions, we could go on, but time is against us, and I think I'd just like to start by saying a huge thank you to all of our panelists, Chris, Samita, Simon and Alexis. I think you've given us a really interesting and provocative start to this week of civic discussions. I'm sure we've all, like Chris, been noting down ideas and suggestions and things to follow up, and through this week we'll be drawing together a whole set of areas for the network as well as for individual institutions to focus on. So we can't do that round of applause thing in the way that we would if we were all in a room, but I'm sure I'm speaking for everyone who's been on the session in expressing our appreciation for all your stimulation and challenge and input. Let me also just thank everyone who's participated. I think it's really interesting range of participants, great range of comments in the chat, really good set of questions that people have asked, and I think we've got a really interesting week ahead of us. Just finally, on behalf of the team, you will have, I think, seen pop up on your screen a feedback poll. Would be great if you can just take a few seconds to answer the question. We're trying to just get a sense of follow-up to these sessions, so please do that. If you're signed up to other events this week, then we look forward to seeing you again. If you're not, then there is still an opportunity to do so, and you just need to go onto the Civic University Network website and you can sign up. Thank you once again, and I hope you have a really good week.